I am Kelsey, 33 years old, and my parents kicked me out on Christmas Eve with nothing, not even allowing me to take a single thing. They looked down at me in the freezing snow and told me I could not do anything on my own, calling me a desperate failure. But when I went to the private bank to use the old metal card my grandfather left me, the bank manager turned pale. He locked the doors, lowered his voice to a whisper, and told me I needed to sit down and see this. I was completely shocked by what appeared on the screen, a revelation that ended their reign of cruelty forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with a concussive boom that sent a shockwave through the freezing Christmas Eve air. I hit the icy concrete of the porch hard, my knees scraping harshly against the frozen steps. The sheer force of the push knocked the breath directly from my lungs. Before I could even gasp for air or orient myself, my weathered canvas tote bag came flying out of the darkness. It struck the snowbank beside me, spilling my cracked laptop and a handful of loose pens into the wet slush. Jamal stepped into the doorframe. At 32, my brother-in-law possessed the intimidating physical presence of a former college athlete combined with the razor-sharp tailoring of a successful hedge fund manager. His dark skin contrasted sharply with the blinding white of his tailored winter coat, and the heavy gold face of his Rolex caught the ambient light from the porch as he crossed his arms. "Get your garbage off my driveway," Jamal sneered, his voice dropping into a low and mocking register. "This is not a charity shelter for washed-up designers." I pushed myself up on numb hands. The thin fabric of my sweater offered zero protection against the biting wind that was already sweeping across the yard. "Your driveway!" I countered, my voice trembling not from fear, but from the sudden, severe drop in temperature. "My grandfather built this house, Jamal. You have only lived here for 8 months. And in 8 months, I have brought more prestige to this family than you have in 33 years, he replied effortlessly. "Look at your laptop, Kelsey. The screen is as broken as your career. You honestly think a top-tier hedge fund manager wants his pregnant wife stressed out by a sister who cannot even hold down a simple tech job?" Catherine, my mother, appeared right behind Jamal. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her lips painted a severe holiday red. She did not look at her eldest daughter with any trace of sympathy. She looked at me like a stain on an otherwise pristine rug. "He is right, Kelsey," Catherine said, folding her arms tightly across her expensive cashmere wrap. "You are 33 years old. You were just fired from the only decent tech firm that would hire you. You let your own team steal your user interface designs because you do not know how to fight for what is yours. And now you expect to crawl back here and eat our food." I stared at my mother, the betrayal burning hotter than the winter air around me. "I did not let them steal anything, Mom." Jamal's firm acquired that tech startup. It was Jamal who buried my non-compete clause in piles of legal jargon. It was Jamal who authorized my termination so his developers could claim my interface architecture for his new trading platform. Jamal laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed across the quiet and snow-covered suburban street. "Welcome to corporate America, Kelsey. You built a brilliant user interface, I will give you that. But you did not own the patents. I do. Now Brittany and I need a peaceful and stress-free environment to prepare for our baby. Having a bitter and unemployed spinster sulking in the guest room ruins the Christmas aesthetic. You engineered my firing just to get me out of the way." My voice cracked as the reality of his manipulation set in. I took a step toward the door, but Jamal shifted, his broad frame entirely blocking the entrance. Catherine shook her head, sighing dramatically. "Always the victim. Always paranoid. Brittany is dealing with severe morning sickness, and she does not need your toxic energy infecting this house. A woman with no husband, no money, and no career has no business ruining the holidays for a family that actually has a bright future." The front door opened wider, and Brittany slipped under Jamal's arm. At 29, my younger sister was the undisputed golden child of the family. She wore a silk maternity gown that draped perfectly over her barely visible bump. But instead of looking peaceful, Her face was contorted in an exaggerated mask of deep distress. Her hands were frantically clutching at her bare collarbone. Jamal Brittany cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. "Jamal, it is gone." "What is gone, baby?" Jamal immediately wrapped a protective arm around her waist, his sneer instantly morphing into an expression of deep concern. "The necklace," Brittany sobbed, pointing a manicured finger directly at me as I shivered in the snow. "The diamond tennis necklace you gave me this morning. I left it on the bathroom counter when I took my shower. She was the only one upstairs. She took it." "I did not go anywhere near your bathroom," I shouted, my teeth beginning to chatter violently as the wind picked up speed. "Brittany, stop lying. I have not been upstairs since yesterday. I did not take your diamonds." "You liar," Brittany wailed loudly, burying her face in Jamal's expensive coat. "She is desperate, Jamal. You said it yourself, she is completely broke. She probably stole it to pawn it so she could pay for some cheap motel room." "Richard." My father marched into the foyer at the sound of the commotion. Hearing his youngest daughter crying sent him into an immediate and blind rage. He pushed past Catherine, his face flushed red with indignation. He did not ask questions. He did not demand an explanation from me. He simply looked at me with a revulsion that felt like a physical blow to my chest. "A failure is one thing," Richard spat, his voice laced with pure venom. "But a thief, in my house, on Christmas Eve." "Dad, I swear to God I did not take anything," I pleaded, my numb fingers gripping the icy metal railing of the porch. "Search my bags, search my coat right now. I do not have her stupid diamonds." "I do not need to search your trash," Richard snapped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of car keys. He pressed a button and the headlights of the Honda sedan parked in the driveway flashed brightly. "That car is registered in my name. I bought it. I pay the insurance on that car." "Dad, please, it is 5 degrees out here." "Then you better start walking fast to keep warm," Richard said coldly. He marched forward onto the porch and ripped the Honda car keys right out of my freezing hands. He pressed the lock button on the key fob with a definitive click, then shoved the keys deep into his pocket. "You are not driving my vehicle to a pawn shop to sell stolen jewelry. You are not sleeping under my roof. If you set foot on this property again, I am calling the police and having you arrested for grand larceny." "You are leaving me on the street with absolutely nothing?" I asked, my voice dropping to a hollow whisper as the cold seeped into my bones. "You brought this on yourself," Catherine added, stepping back into the warmth of the foyer. "Merry Christmas, Kelsey. Try to grow up." Jamal did not say a word. He just offered one final victorious smirk before grabbing the heavy oak door and slamming it shut. The deadbolt clicked loudly from the inside. A second later, the porch lights flicked off, plunging me into total darkness and sub-zero temperatures, leaving me completely alone in the freezing snow. The icy wind whipped violently through the barren branches of the suburban oak trees, driving sharp crystals of snow directly into my face. I stumbled forward, my boots crunching heavily against the frozen pavement. Every step sent a jolt of pain up my legs. The thin wool of my sweater provided absolutely no defense against the sub-zero temperature, and the damp cold had already soaked through to my skin. I wrapped my arms tightly around my chest, hunching my shoulders to preserve whatever tiny fraction of body heat remained. A massive city snowplow roared down the avenue, its yellow hazard lights flashing blindly through the storm. I tried to step back onto the curb, but my numb feet betrayed me. The heavy steel blade of the plow caught a massive drift of gray slush, launching a freezing wave of dirty water and snow directly over me. I gasped as the icy slush hit my legs, soaking my jeans instantly. I dragged myself out of the street and ducked under the plexiglass awning of a dark bus stop. The small shelter did little to block the wind, but it gave me a brief moment to catch my breath. I dropped my frayed canvas tote bag onto the freezing metal bench. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely work the zipper. I needed bus fare. I needed a few quarters to get to a 24-hour diner, a train station, anywhere with 4 walls and a heating vent to survive the night. I shoved my frozen fingers deep into the lining of my old winter coat, desperately searching for forgotten coins. My fingertips scraped against the rough fabric of the pocket lining. Instead of a coin, my hand brushed against something heavy and metallic. It was freezing to the touch, much colder than a simple quarter. I pulled it out and held it up to the dim glow of the street lamp overhead. It was a thick, matte black metal card. It carried no bank logo, no magnetic strip, and no embossed account numbers. It was completely unbranded, heavy enough to weigh down my palm. Right next to it, tangled in the frayed fabric of the pocket, was a small, intricately carved brass key. I stared at the items, my breath pluming in the icy air. My mind instantly flashed back to a sterile hospital room 3 years ago. The persistent rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor echoed in my memory. My grandfather Theodore had been lying in the narrow bed, his skin pale and thin like parchment. The illness had ravaged his body, but it had never touched the sharp, calculating gleam in his eyes. Outside the closed hospital room door, I could hear my parents arguing with the doctors. Richard and Catherine were loudly complaining about the medical bills, insisting that Theodore had squandered the family fortune on bad investments and left them with nothing but a sprawling estate they could barely afford to maintain in the suburbs. They were already discussing selling his remaining assets before his heart had even stopped beating. Theodore had coughed weakly, reaching out with a trembling hand to grab my wrist. He pulled me closer, his grip surprisingly strong for a dying man. He pressed this exact metal card and the small brass key into my palm, forcing my fingers closed tightly over them. "Your parents are absolute fools, Kelsey." Theodore had wheezed, his voice a raspy whisper that carried more authority than Richard ever possessed in his entire life. "They chase the illusion of wealth and completely ignore the substance. They think I am dying a bankrupt failure because that is exactly what I wanted them to believe. I built an empire, and I will not let their shallow greed tear it apart to fund country club memberships and designer clothes." I had tried to speak to tell him to rest, but he silenced me with a fierce, uncompromising look. "Listen to me carefully," he had said, coughing again. "When the day comes that they cast you aside, and they absolutely will because their greed has no bottom, you take this card to the central branch of Vanguard Private Wealth. Do not go to a regular teller. You ask for Mr. Henderson. Tell him Theodore sent you. You only use this when you have absolutely nothing left. Do you understand me, Kelsey? When they leave you with nothing." At the time, I thought it was the feverish rambling of a dying man. My parents had spent the last 3 years complaining about Theodore's financial ruin. They used his supposed bankruptcy as a convenient excuse to deny me any help when I was struggling to pay off my student loans, claiming they were burdened by the debts he left behind. They had auctioned off his antique furniture and constantly played the victims of his bad financial management to anyone in their social circle who would listen. I stood in the freezing bus stop, gripping the cold metal card in my hand. The sharp, precisely cut edges of the heavy metal dug into my skin, grounding me in reality. The violent shivering that had racked my body slowly began to subside, replaced by a sudden, surging rush of adrenaline. The biting cold did not matter anymore. The deep sting of betrayal did not matter anymore. My parents had lied. They had lied about Theodore. They had lied about their finances to maintain a fabricated image. Jamal thought he had brilliantly stripped me of my career by stealing my software designs and firing me. Catherine thought she had stripped me of my dignity by labeling me a bitter failure. Brittany thought she had successfully framed me for a stolen necklace to secure her spot as the undisputed golden child. Richard thought he had completely ruined me by revoking my car keys and leaving me to freeze on the street on Christmas Eve. They all thought I was a helpless victim who would crawl away and vanish quietly into the night. I looked up from the black card. Through the swirling snow, the towering skyscrapers of the financial district loomed in the distance, their aviation warning lights blinking steadily against the dark winter sky. I tucked the card and the brass key safely into an inner zippered pocket of my coat. I grabbed the strap of my tote bag, hoisting my broken laptop over my shoulder. I was not going to a public shelter. I was not going to cry in a cheap diner. I was going to survive this freezing night, walk every single block to the downtown sector, and wait right outside those heavy glass doors. Because tomorrow morning the banks would open. And I was going to find Mr. Henderson. The trek from the frozen suburban outskirts to the towering steel and glass canyons of the financial district took 5 agonizing hours. I walked through the darkest part of the night, my wet jeans freezing solid against my skin, and my breath crystallizing in the bitter air. Every single step required a monumental effort of will, my muscles burning and protesting against the extreme cold. The only thing keeping my heart beating and my legs moving was the heavy cold weight of the metal cards secured safely in my inner pocket. As the bruised purple sky slowly gave way to the pale, sterile gray of dawn, the city began to wake up around me. Sleek black luxury sedans navigated the newly plowed streets, dropping off wealthy executives in tailored wool coats and expensive leather briefcases. I kept my head down, ignoring the burning ache in my frostbitten toes and the violent shivering that racked my spine. I focused entirely on the massive limestone facade looming at the end of the block. The engraved bronze letters above the revolving glass doors read Vanguard Private Wealth. I pushed through the heavy brass-trimmed doors, just as the antique grandfather clock in the center of the lobby struck 8. A wall of incredibly warm cedar-scented air hit my face, making my numb skin prickle with sudden sharp pain. The lobby was an absolute masterpiece of corporate intimidation. High vaulted ceilings featured intricate crown molding, and the expansive floors were paved with flawless mirror-polished Italian marble. A massive crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the scattering of early morning clients who sat in plush leather armchairs sipping espresso and reading financial papers. I stepped further onto the pristine marble, my ruined, slush-covered boots, leaving a trail of dirty gray water in my wake. The contrast was incredibly jarring. I looked like a discarded piece of trash that the winter wind had accidentally blown into a palace. Several clients glanced up from their tablets, their faces twisting in immediate disgust before they quickly averted their eyes, pretending I did not exist. I did not care about their judgmental stares. I gripped the fraying strap of my canvas tote bag, feeling the jagged edges of my shattered laptop pressing against my hip. I squared my shoulders and began walking toward the imposing mahogany reception desk at the far end of the grand hall. I had only made it a dozen paces before a towering security guard stepped directly into my path. He wore a crisp, dark suit with a discreet communication earpiece, his posture rigid and openly hostile. He crossed his arms, his broad chest completely blocking my line of sight to the front desk. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my violently shivering frame, my torn, damp sweater, and the dirty snow rapidly melting off my tangled hair. He did not ask if I needed assistance. He did not offer a polite corporate greeting. He leaned in close, his expression mirroring the exact same arrogant disdain I had seen on Jamal's face just hours ago. "Ma'am, the public shelter is 3 blocks down. You need to leave before I call the police." His voice was low, threatening, and dripping with contempt. Yesterday, a threat like that would have made me shrink away. Yesterday, I would have apologized profusely, backed out the door, and disappeared into the snow out of pure shame. But the years of shrinking away from Jamal's arrogant taunts and my parents' vicious insults had frozen and shattered somewhere on the icy sidewalk last night. I did not argue with him. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not offer any explanation. I stepped precisely to the right, bypassing the guard's broad shoulder with a cold, unwavering momentum that caught him entirely off guard. Before he could reach out and grab my arm to physically remove me, I was already standing at the front of the massive mahogany reception desk. The receptionist, sitting behind the elevated counter, looked like she belonged on the cover of a high-fashion magazine. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless bun, and her perfectly manicured fingers were poised over a glowing wireless keyboard. She glared down at the growing puddle of melting snow forming around my ruined boots, her lips pressed together in a tight line of pure outrage, deeply offended by my mere presence in her immaculate workspace. "Can I help you?" she asked, dragging out the syllables with a condescending drawl to ensure I felt exactly how unwelcome I was in her pristine environment. I did not say a single word. I reached deep into my damp coat pocket, pulled out the heavy, unbranded black metal card and dropped it directly onto the polished mahogany surface. The metal hit the expensive wood with a loud, definitive thud that echoed sharply in the quiet lobby. The noise caused a few nearby clients to look up from their coffee cups. The receptionist rolled her eyes, huffing an exasperated sigh. She clearly assumed it was a fake novelty item or some worthless piece of plastic from a desperate vagrant. She picked it up with a dramatic display of reluctance, gripping the edges with just 2 fingers, as if the card itself might contaminate her. Without looking at it closely, she reached over and tapped the heavy metal aggressively against the concealed scanner embedded seamlessly in the surface of the desk. A sharp, piercing chime immediately rang out from the secure terminal. The ambient blue glow of her monitor instantly vanished, replaced by a harsh, flashing crimson-red light that illuminated her carefully contoured face. The receptionist froze. Her annoyed, condescending expression completely evaporated in a fraction of a second, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. The color drained from her cheeks so fast she looked physically ill. She dropped the heavy metal card onto the desk, as if the temperature of the metal had suddenly turned to boiling lead. Without breaking eye contact with me, her eyes wide with sudden panic, her trembling hand disappeared beneath the mahogany counter, and she frantically slammed her palm against the emergency panic button. Less than a second after the receptionist slammed her palm onto the concealed panic button, the heavy atmosphere in the lobby shifted. The silent alarm did not trigger blaring sirens or flashing strobes, but the response was immediate. The towering security guard who had threatened me earlier moved with sudden aggressive speed. He unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt and lunged forward, his massive hand reaching out to grab my frozen, soaking wet shoulder. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I kept my eyes locked on the receptionist, whose face remained drained of all color. Before the guard's thick fingers could even brush the damp wool of my sweater, the massive mahogany double doors at the far end of the lobby burst violently open. They hit the marble walls with a resounding crack that made several clients jump out of their leather armchairs. A man in his late 50s wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit practically sprinted across the polished marble floor. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy that completely defied his distinguished appearance. His silver hair was slightly disheveled, and his face was flushed with absolute panic. This was a man used to projecting total control, yet right now he looked entirely terrified. "Stop right there," he roared, his voice echoing sharply off the vaulted ceilings. "Step away from her immediately." The security guard froze in his tracks, his hand hovering mere inches from my arm. "Sir, this woman triggered the priority alert. She is trespassing and complaining about—" "I said step away!" the man barked, not breaking his stride. He reached us in seconds and did something that shocked everyone in the lobby. He shoved the massive security guard completely aside, using his shoulder to physically push the much larger man out of my personal space. The guard stumbled backward, his mouth hanging open in utter disbelief. The executive turned to face me. He looked down at my ruined, slush-covered boots, the dirty water pooling on his pristine marble floor, and the violent shivers that still occasionally racked my thin frame. When his eyes met mine, I saw a profound mixture of immense respect and deep, undeniable fear. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dropping into a frantic, pleading whisper, "please, come with me right now." I recognized his face from the business profiles my grandfather used to read. This was Arthur Henderson, the senior branch manager and regional director of Vanguard Private Wealth. He was one of the most powerful financial gatekeepers in the city, a man whom my father Richard had spent years desperately trying to secure a mere 5-minute networking meeting with. Right now, this titan of finance was bowing his head to me. I did not say a word. I simply picked up the heavy black metal card from the reception desk, slipped it back into my damp pocket, and gave him a single curt nod. Henderson instantly turned and extended his arm, gesturing toward the executive corridor with the utmost deference. He cleared a path for me, glaring sharply at any client or staff member who dared to stare at my disheveled state. We walked through the grand lobby, my wet boots squeaking loudly against the stone, leaving a trail of dirty snowmelt all the way to the heavy, secure doors. He guided me through a maze of quiet, plushly carpeted hallways. We bypassed the standard glass-walled meeting rooms and continued until we reached a dead end facing a massive solid steel door embedded directly into the stone architecture. Henderson placed his hand on a biometric scanner, entered a complex 12-digit passcode, and leaned in for a retinal scan. The heavy steel door unsealed with a deep hydraulic hiss. He ushered me inside and quickly pulled the door shut behind us. The heavy locking mechanisms engaged automatically, sealing us in. The VIP vault was unlike any banking office I had ever seen. It was designed to resemble a high-end private study. Rich mahogany paneled the walls, thick Persian rugs covered the floor, and the air was deliberately heated to a comfortable, enveloping warmth. The absolute silence in the room was jarring. The soundproofing was so intense that the bustling city outside completely ceased to exist. Henderson practically ran over to a discreet wet bar in the corner of the room. His hands were physically shaking as he grabbed a porcelain cup and poured steaming black coffee from a silver carafe. He hurried back and offered the cup to me, using both hands holding it out like a vital peace offering. I took the coffee, letting the intense heat sear through the ceramic and seep into my frostbitten fingers. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark roast burned its way down my throat, finally thawing the icy knot of tension that had been sitting in my chest since Jamal threw me into the snow. "I am so deeply sorry for the behavior of my staff," Miss Kelsey Henderson said, his voice tight with anxiety as he hovered awkwardly near his massive desk. "They do not know what that card means. They are strictly trained to follow standard protocols, but I assure you the guard and the receptionist will be severely disciplined for disrespecting you." I walked over to his desk, placed my coffee cup down, and reached into my pocket. I pulled out the black metal card and the carved brass key, setting them side by side on the spotless leather blotter. "Discipline is irrelevant right now. Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice completely steady, "I was told to come to you when I had absolutely nothing left." Henderson stared at the card and the key. He swallowed hard, visibly composing himself before walking around the desk and taking his seat. He pulled a specialized encrypted keyboard from a hidden drawer and began typing at a furious pace. "Your grandfather left extremely specific, unbreakable instructions," Henderson said, his eyes scanning the data scrolling across his monitor. "He anticipated that your parents might attempt to leverage his legacy or hide the truth of his assets from you. He structured a multi-tiered legal barricade to ensure they could never access the core capital." Henderson paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He looked up at me, his expression shifting from anxious deference to serious professional gravity. "We have been waiting for you since your 33rd birthday last week, Miss Kelsey," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "That was the precise date your grandfather stipulated the primary locking mechanisms would expire provided you presented the physical key and the executive command card in person." He pressed a final key on his terminal. The massive curved monitor on his desk beeped sharply. Henderson gripped the edges of the screen and turned it around so it faced me directly. "You need to see this." I stepped closer, my eyes locking onto the glowing high-resolution display. At the very top of the screen, rendered in bold, undeniable text, were the words "Theodore Vanguard Trust." Beneath that header was a sprawling, infinitely complex web of corporate holdings. International real estate portfolios, silent partnerships, and liquid capital reserves. The numbers attached to the bottom line were so vast, they looked entirely fictional. My breath hitched in my throat. My parents had spent the last 3 years spinning a pathetic, tragic tale about how Theodore died a bankrupt failure. They had auctioned off his vintage watches, complained about his supposed debts, and used his fictional financial ruin to justify their own selfish greed. But the screen told the absolute, undeniable truth. My grandfather never went bankrupt. He had hidden an absolute empire. I stared at the glowing numbers cascading across the curved monitor. My mind struggled to process the sheer scale of the wealth displayed before me. There were too many zeros, too many subsidiary companies listed in neat, endless rows. I traced my finger just above the glass of the screen, reading names of holding companies, commercial real estate portfolios, and international index funds. The screen was a masterpiece of financial architecture, a hidden fortress built quietly in the shadows, while my parents paraded around country clubs pretending to be high society. Henderson stepped up beside me. His demeanor had entirely shifted from the panicked branch manager in the lobby to a high-level wealth advisor addressing his most important client. "Your grandfather understood human nature, Miss Kelsey," he said smoothly, adjusting his tailored jacket. He knew that Richard and Catherine were driven entirely by appearances. If he had simply cut them off completely, they would have tied his estate up in endless messy litigation out of pure spite. Instead, he gave them a gilded cage. A gilded cage, I repeated, my eyes scanning a section of the dashboard labeled Operational Allowances. Precisely, Henderson nodded. Your parents are not wealthy. They possess no actual capital. They are merely authorized users on a highly restricted superficial allowance account generated by the trust dividend overflow. The country club memberships, the leased luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, it is all meticulously budgeted and capped by a board of trustees. They do not own a single tangible asset. They are putting on a theatrical performance funded by a man they constantly claim was a financial failure. The sheer audacity of it all washed over me in a wave of cold clarity. I thought about Catherine adjusting her expensive cashmere wrap on the porch, calling me a failure. I thought about her sneering at my canvas tote bag. My mother had spent her entire life judging my career choices, belittling my hard work, and acting like she was self-made royalty. In reality, she was living on a strict allowance like a misbehaving teenager. "The house," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My father stood on the driveway and explicitly said the house was his. Henderson offered a tight, clinical smile. "Richard holds no deed. The suburban estate they occupy is entirely owned by Vanguard Holdings. They are for all legal intents and purposes glorified tenants living rent-free at the absolute pleasure of the trust. If the trust decides to terminate their occupancy, they have zero legal recourse." The image of Richard waving the car keys in my face flashed in my mind. He had revoked my access to a cheap sedan to punish me acting like the supreme ruler of his domain. He had kicked me out into the snow, calling me a parasite when he and my mother were the actual parasites feeding off the very man they constantly insulted. They had mocked my broken laptop and my empty bank accounts while wearing clothes paid for by an allowance they did nothing to earn. "So what exactly did my grandfather leave me?" I asked, turning to face the branch manager directly. My wet clothes were finally starting to dry in the intense warmth of the VIP vault, and the physical shivering had been entirely replaced by a sharp, focused energy. Henderson gestured to the carved brass key resting on his desk next to my coffee cup. "If you will allow me, Miss Kelsey." I nodded. He picked up the intricately carved key and inserted it into a hidden manual override slot located discreetly beneath his keyboard console. He turned it sharply. The computer screen flashed green. A massive progress bar quickly loaded across the display, followed by a new heavily encrypted document populating the screen. The Vanguard crest appeared at the top, stamped with legal digital signatures. "The Theodore Vanguard Trust executes its primary directive today," Henderson announced, reading the legal text with deep professional reverence. "You are hereby named the sole undisputed owner of 51% of the Vanguard Empire. You hold the controlling interest. Your parents, your sister, and any spouses have absolutely zero voting rights and zero access to the principal capital. You possess absolute authority over every asset, every property, and every subsidiary within this network. 51%. The words echoed in the soundproof vault. I was not just a beneficiary receiving a passive payout. I was the majority shareholder. I had the power to liquidate, acquire, freeze, and mandate every single operation within this massive corporate structure. The frightened, freezing woman, who had been thrown into the winter night, was gone. In her place stood the chief executive of the very foundation my family had used to look down on the world. Grandpa Theodore had not just given me money, he had given me a weapon. I looked back at the screen, my analytical brain rapidly shifting gears into executive mode. The user interface of the trust portal was slightly clunky, but the data hierarchy was perfectly clear. I could see the exact parameters of my family's shallow existence mapped out in secure spreadsheets. Henderson tapped the screen, pulling up a specific financial subfolder categorized under high-risk venture capital and private lending. "Your grandfather was a very thorough man," Henderson said, his tone growing serious. "He kept meticulous tabs on the people your family associated with, particularly those who married into it. He instructed me to monitor this specific file until you arrived. He said you would know exactly what to do with it when the time came." I leaned in closer, my eyes instantly recognizing the structural flow of the data presented. It was a massive corporate debt ledger. There were charts showing volatile cash injections, secured loans against projected returns, and aggressive leverage ratios. It was the financial profile of a firm operating recklessly on borrowed time and borrowed money. "What is this?" I asked, tracing the jagged downward spikes of the financial graphs. Henderson pointed directly to the title of the corporate portfolio on the screen. "And it appears, Miss Kelsey, that your trust is the primary creditor and silent backer for your brother-in-law Jamal's hedge fund." I stared at the screen, analyzing the architecture of Jamal's financial arrogance. It was a poorly designed system built entirely on a foundation of borrowed stability. In my profession, when a user interface is broken, you do not patch it with temporary fixes. You strip it down to the base code. You sever the faulty connections. You rebuild. I did not shed a single tear. The icy numbness that had settled deep into my bones overnight vanished, replaced by a crystalline, hyper-focused clarity. I understood the system now, and I had the administrative privileges to dismantle it piece by piece. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice carrying a steady, uncompromising authority that surprised even me. "I want you to access the operational allowance accounts for Richard and Catherine. I want every supplementary credit card under their names frozen immediately. Cut their monthly allowance down to absolute zero." Henderson did not hesitate. His fingers flew across the encrypted keyboard. "Executing now. Miss Kelsey, all primary and secondary cards attached to the Suburban Estates Discretionary Fund are being deactivated. Their spending power is officially zeroed out." I leaned closer to the monitor, tapping my index finger directly against the file folder bearing Jamal's name and his supposedly elite hedge fund. Jamal had stood on that freezing porch just hours ago, bragging about how much prestige he brought to the family, mocking my broken laptop and my lost career. He had looked down on me, completely unaware that he was standing on ground I owned, funded by money I controlled. "And trigger an immediate no-notice financial audit on Jamal's firm," I commanded, locking eyes with Henderson. "Deploy our most aggressive forensic accounting team. I want every ledger, every wire transfer, and every offshore margin call ripped open and exposed. Let us see exactly what he is doing with my money." A full blindside audit. Henderson confirmed, a sharp, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The team will be deployed within the hour. By lunchtime, Jamal's compliance officers will have our auditors locking down his servers. He will not be able to move a single cent without our direct authorization." "Excellent. Now I need a secure mobile device linked directly to the trust portal, a small cash advance, and the highest tier executive card you can issue." Within 30 minutes, I walked out of the VIP vault, a completely different woman. I was no longer the shivering outcast discarded in the snow. I held a sleek, heavily encrypted smartphone and a titanium Vanguard executive card bearing my own name. The storm outside had broken, the morning sun reflecting brightly off the snow-covered streets of the financial district. I hailed a private black car, directing the driver to the Grand Solstice, the most exclusive five-star hotel in the city center. When I walked through the towering glass doors of the Grand Solstice, my ruined boots and damp sweater still drew a few questioning glances from the pristine concierge staff. The front desk manager stepped forward, clearly preparing a polite but firm speech about the hotel being fully booked for the holiday season. I did not give him the chance to speak. I simply slid the titanium Vanguard executive card across the polished marble counter. The manager's rehearsed smile dropped. He recognized the heavy metal immediately. His posture straightened, his tone shifting instantly from dismissive to absolute reverence. "Welcome to the Grand Solstice, ma'am. How may we accommodate you today? I require your top-floor penthouse suite," I stated evenly, as well as a personal shopper dispatched immediately to secure a new professional wardrobe. "Charge everything to the card." "Right away, Miss Kelsey. The private elevator is ready for you." As the gold-paneled elevator shot upward, carrying me toward a sprawling luxury suite overlooking the entire city, a very different scene was unfolding 10 miles away in the city's most affluent shopping district. Catherine stood at the checkout counter of an exclusive designer boutique, her chin tipped upward in her signature pose of manufactured superiority. She had just finished a lavish morning of holiday shopping, eager to reward herself after the minor inconvenience of throwing her eldest daughter out into the freezing night. The glass counter was piled high with expensive cashmere sweaters, imported leather handbags, and crystal holiday centerpieces meant to impress Jamal's wealthy investors at their upcoming New Year's Eve gala. "That will be $8,420, the boutique manager said with a polite, practiced smile. Catherine did not even look at the price. She simply pulled her sleek platinum credit card from her designer wallet and handed it over with a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Put it on the primary account, and have your staff carry the bags to my car. I cannot be expected to haul these boxes through the snow." The manager swiped the card through the terminal. The machine emitted a harsh, flat beep. The screen flashed a bright red error message. "I apologize, ma'am," the manager said, a subtle hint of confusion breaking her professional facade. "It seems your card has been declined." Catherine scoffed loudly, drawing the attention of several other wealthy shoppers browsing nearby racks. "Declined? That is absolutely impossible. You must have swiped it wrong. The machine is clearly malfunctioning. Run it again." The manager swiped the card a second time. Another harsh beep echoed through the quiet, elegant boutique. The red error message remained stubbornly on the screen. "I am sorry," the manager said, her tone dropping a fraction of its warmth. "The terminal is working perfectly. The bank is refusing the charge. Do you have another form of payment you would prefer to use?" Catherine's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. Her socialite friends were definitely watching now, whispering behind their hands. "This is an outrage. Do you know who I am? Do you know who my husband is? We are top-tier clients. Let me call my wealth manager right this second. Someone is going to be fired for this humiliating mistake." Catherine snatched her phone from her purse, her manicured fingers aggressively dialing the direct line for Vanguard Private Wealth. She tapped her foot impatiently against the hardwood floor, glaring daggers at the boutique staff while the phone rang. The call connected, but instead of the usual fawning personal assistant, she was greeted by an automated, sterile corporate voice. "We are sorry. The operational allowance account associated with this number has been permanently frozen by order of the majority shareholder. Your current available balance is $0.00. If you feel this is an error, please consult the primary account holder." Catherine stood frozen in the middle of the boutique, the automated voice echoing from her phone speaker. The cashmere sweaters and leather handbags sitting on the counter suddenly looked like heavy anchors. She stared at the declined plastic card in her hand, her perfectly curated illusion of wealth cracking wide open in front of the exact people she spent her entire life trying to impress. High up in the Grand Solstice penthouse, the world felt entirely different. The silence of the suite was absolute, insulated by thick glass and heavy doors, a stark contrast to the freezing, chaotic streets I had trudged through just hours prior. I stood in the center of the massive living area, looking out over the sprawling skyline of the financial district. My fingers traced the smooth fabric of the charcoal gray tailored blazer I now wore. The personal shopper the hotel provided had arrived within an hour, bringing a curated selection of executive wear. I discarded the damp, ruined sweater and the frozen jeans, leaving them in a crumpled pile on the marble bathroom floor. I scrubbed the dirt and freezing slush from my skin under a scalding shower, washing away the last lingering traces of my family's toxic household. When I emerged, I dressed in the sharp, structured suit. The crisp lines of the fabric acted like a suit of armor. I pulled my hair back into a sleek professional style. The exhausted, shivering outcast who had been thrown onto the icy pavement was completely gone. I set up my new encrypted smartphone and a high-end laptop on the glass dining table, immediately diving into the initial audit reports Mr. Henderson's forensic accounting team was already uploading to the secure Vanguard portal. The data was flowing in rapidly, revealing a chaotic web of Jamal's panicked financial maneuvers. He was bleeding capital, and the sudden freeze on his supplementary accounts had clearly sent him into an absolute tailspin. Down in the lobby exactly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the tranquility of the grand solstice was violently shattered. Jamal had not taken the sudden suspension of his financial lifelines quietly. Accustomed to wielding his hedge fund title like a weapon, he had immediately leveraged his elite industry connections and aggressively tracked the automated alert tags generated when the supplementary accounts were severed. Those alerts had led him straight to the geographic location of the newly issued executive card. He did not come alone. My father, Richard, marched right beside him, his face a mask of self-righteous fury. To complete their intimidation tactic, Jamal had flagged down 2 city police officers, spinning a frantic, highly exaggerated story about a deranged, unemployed family member who had stolen corporate credit credentials to fund a massive, fraudulent spending spree. Jamal used his expensive tailored coat, his heavy gold Rolex, and his booming, authoritative voice to command the officers' attention, painting himself as the wealthy victim of a desperate thief. The heavy mahogany double doors of my penthouse suite suddenly shook with a series of violent, aggressive blows. The pounding was so loud it rattled the modern art frames hanging on the walls. "Open this door right now!" Jamal roared from the hallway, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated rage. "I know you are in there, Kelsey. You stole my developer's code, you ruined my morning, and now you are committing credit card fraud to live large in a 5-star hotel. Open up before they kick it down." I did not jump. My heart did not race. I simply closed the lid of my laptop, securing the audit files, and stood up from the glass table. "Kelsey," Richard shouted, his voice joining the chaotic chorus outside, "you have embarrassed this family for the absolute last time. Your mother is in tears at a boutique because you somehow hacked our accounts. You are going to prison for this." "Ma'am," a deep, stern voice interrupted. "This is the police. Step away from the door, keep your hands where we can see them, and exit the suite immediately. We have building security standing by, and we will breach the door if you refuse to comply." I smoothed the lapels of my charcoal blazer. I checked my reflection in the gilded hallway mirror one last time. There was no fear in my eyes, only a cold, calculating determination. The family that had discarded me like trash was now banging on my door, completely oblivious to the fact that they were demanding entry into a fortress I owned. I walked slowly toward the entrance. I reached out, grasped the heavy brass handle, and unlatched the deadbolt with a loud, definitive click. I pulled the massive double doors open wide. Jamal had his arm raised, ready to pound his fist against the wood again, but he froze mid-motion. Richard stood right behind him, his face flushed and angry purple, his mouth open to hurl another barrage of insults. The 2 police officers stood flanking them, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts, expecting a frantic, disheveled criminal to burst out in a panic. Instead, I stepped forward into the bright, recessed lighting of the luxury corridor. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands relaxed and completely visible at my sides. The crisp, structured lines of my tailored suit projected an undeniable, quiet authority. I did not shrink back from the officers, nor did I flinch at Jamal's towering presence. I locked eyes with my brother-in-law, my expression utterly calm and completely devoid of the victimhood he so desperately wanted to see. Jamal's hand dropped slowly to his side. The triumphant, aggressive sneer he had worn just moments ago faltered for a fraction of a second as his eyes scanned my impeccably tailored suit and my completely unbothered posture. But a man fueled entirely by ego rarely admits defeat. His initial shock quickly curdled into an even darker, more venomous rage. He crossed his arms tightly over his broad chest, making a deliberate show of pulling back his coat sleeve, so the heavy gold face of his Rolex caught the ambient light of the hallway. "Arrest her," Jamal commanded, turning his attention to the two police officers. "Do not let this expensive little costume fool you. She is a disgruntled, unemployed tech dropout who stole her parents' identity to book this $10,000 suite. She is dangerous, deeply in debt, and completely unstable." The older of the two police officers frowned, stepping forward with his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. He looked from my sharp professional attire to Jamal's aggressive stance, clearly trying to reconcile the conflicting visuals. "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone firm but measured. "We received a report of fraudulent credit activity and identity theft. I need you to step out into the hallway and provide a valid form of identification immediately." "I am perfectly happy to cooperate, officer," I replied, my voice steady and resonant in the quiet luxury corridor. "But I assure you the only fraud occurring here is the fictional narrative my brother-in-law is currently spinning to save his own fragile ego." Richard pushed past Jamal, his face contorted into a mask of absolute disgust. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Do not listen to a single word she says, officer. She is my daughter, and she has been a complete disaster her entire life. She was fired from her job yesterday. We kicked her out of our house last night because she tried to steal her sister's jewelry. And this morning, my wife's credit cards were mysteriously declined all over the city. She somehow hacked our accounts. She stole our money to play pretend in a penthouse. She is a thief. Put her in handcuffs right now before she tries to escape." Jamal let out a loud, mocking laugh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a delusional child. He looked at the officers, adopting the patronizing tone of a reasonable, wealthy man burdened by a chaotic, parasitic relative. "You have to understand, gentlemen, she is completely detached from reality. She used to work for me for a tech startup my hedge fund recently acquired. She could not even design a basic user interface without my firm bailing her out and fixing her messy amateur code. She was a massive liability. I had to terminate her employment to protect my investors and clean up her disaster of a project. And now, because she cannot handle the reality of her own failures, she resorts to stealing from her own parents to fund this pathetic illusion of success. Look at her standing there like she runs the world. It is sad, really. She is completely delusional." The younger police officer pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, taking a definitive step toward me. "Ma'am, turn around and place your hands behind your back. We are going to detain you while we sort out the financial records with the hotel management down in the lobby." I did not step back. I did not raise my hands in surrender. I held my ground, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with Jamal. He grinned broadly, shifting his weight eagerly, anticipating the exact moment the cold steel would snap shut around my wrists. He wanted the absolute humiliation. He wanted the complete destruction of my dignity in front of an audience so he could go home and boast to Brittany and Catherine about how he put me in my place. "I am not going to turn around," I stated calmly, addressing the officers while keeping my eyes locked dead on Jamal. "Because you do not have the jurisdiction to arrest the majority shareholder of the corporation that owns the very building you are currently standing in." Richard scoffed loudly, waving his hands in pure exasperation. "Listen to her insane rambling. She has completely lost her mind. Majority shareholder. She did not even have $50 to her name last night when I took my car keys back. Arrest her right this second." The older officer sighed heavily, clearly losing his patience with the escalating family drama echoing down the five-star corridor. "Ma'am, I am not going to ask you again. Place your hands behind your back, or we will be forced to use physical compliance." I reached slowly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored blazer. Both officers instantly tensed their hands, dropping immediately to their service weapons. I moved deliberately, making absolutely sure every single motion was visible, slow, and non-threatening. I pulled out the heavy, unbranded black metal card and held it out flat on my open palm for the officers to clearly see. "I am simply showing you my identification," I said, keeping my voice incredibly even. Jamal sneered at the dark metal, rolling his eyes with a theatrical groan. It is probably a fake hotel keycard she cloned, or some worthless piece of plastic she found in the trash. Stop entertaining her lies and just cuff her already. Before the officers could reach out to examine the heavy black card in my hand, a soft melodic chime echoed cleanly through the silent luxury corridor. Everyone froze in their tracks. 30 feet down the hallway, the polished brass doors of the private VIP-only elevator began to slide open smoothly. The heavy, aggressive tension in the air instantly shifted as 5 figures stepped out of the elevator cabin and onto the plush, thick carpet of the penthouse level. Leading the group was Mr. Henderson. His bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit looked sharper than ever, and his expression was a rigid mask of cold, uncompromising corporate authority. Flanking him closely were 4 elite corporate lawyers, all dressed in immaculate, dark, custom-tailored suits. They carried thick leather briefcases and radiated an aura of immense, undeniable legal power. They moved in perfect synchronized unison, their expensive leather shoes completely silent against the carpet, walking with purposeful intensity directly toward our tense standoff outside the penthouse doors. Mr. Henderson stopped just short of the younger police officer. The lead lawyer, a tall woman with piercing eyes and a perfectly tailored navy suit, stepped smoothly between the officers and me. She did not raise her voice. She did not display a single ounce of panic. She simply opened her thick leather briefcase and extracted a dense stack of heavily watermarked notarized legal documents. Officers, there is a profound misunderstanding occurring here, the lead lawyer stated, handing the thick file directly to the older officer. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am Senior Corporate Counsel for the Theodore Vanguard Trust. The building you are currently standing in, the Grand Solstice Hotel, is a wholly owned subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings, and the woman you are attempting to unlawfully detain is Miss Kelsey Vanguard, the undisputed majority shareholder and chief executive of that exact holding company. The older officer took the documents. He scanned the embossed seals, the authenticated signatures, and the undeniable legal proofs of ownership. His partner immediately took a large step back, holstering the heavy steel handcuffs he had been so eager to use just seconds prior. The aggressive, suspicious posture of law enforcement dissolved instantly into a stance of cautious respect. Jamal let out a sharp bark of disbelief. That is a complete fabrication. She is an unemployed designer who was fired yesterday. She is forging those papers. Officer, do your job and arrest her. Evelyn Carter turned her piercing gaze directly onto Jamal. She did not blink. Actually, Mr. Jamal, the only person actively committing a felony in this corridor is you. You used a corporate tracking system to locate my client by monitoring the automated alerts on a supplementary allowance account. An account that was officially frozen this morning by order of the primary trust holder. You then brought law enforcement to this location under the guise of credit card fraud, attempting to authorize police action using financial credentials you no longer possess and do not legally control. Jamal opened his mouth to argue, but the high-powered attorney did not give him a fraction of a second to interrupt. She took a single step toward him, her presence entirely overwhelming his arrogant posture. Filing a false police report is a crime, she continued, her voice razor-sharp. Attempting to leverage frozen corporate trust funds to initiate a fraudulent arrest constitutes financial fraud and malicious prosecution. We have already logged the timestamp of your alert tracking against the exact moment the accounts were severed by my client. The digital paper trail is absolute and it points directly to your willful criminal misconduct. The older officer handed the documents back to Carter with a respectful nod. He turned to face Jamal, his hand dropping back down to his utility belt, but this time the gesture was directed squarely at my brother-in-law. Sir, the officer warned, his voice dropping into a harsh, no-nonsense register. You need to step away from this door right now. If you continue to disrupt this floor or file any more false reports wasting police resources, I will personally put you in handcuffs and haul you downtown for fraud. Jamal's jaw clenched so tightly a visible muscle ticked in his cheek. The dark, venomous rage in his eyes warred with the sudden terrifying realization that he had completely lost control of the situation. He looked at the police, then at the wall of elite corporate lawyers, and finally at me. I stood perfectly still, my expression a mask of cold, unbothered authority. I had not needed to raise my voice or defend myself. My grandfather's legacy had spoken for me, crushing Jamal's inflated ego under the sheer weight of absolute corporate power. Richard, realizing the catastrophic legal trap they had just walked into, grabbed Jamal by the arm of his expensive winter coat. "We are leaving," Richard muttered, his face drained of all its previous self-righteous fury. He physically pulled Jamal backward toward the polished brass doors of the elevator. As the elevator doors slid open, Richard turned back to face me. The initial shock in his eyes was rapidly being replaced by a desperate, bitter hatred. He pointed a shaking finger at my chest. "You manipulated a dying man's will," Richard sneered, his voice echoing bitterly down the luxury corridor. "We will destroy you in court." The polished brass doors of the elevator slid shut smoothly, sealing Richard and Jamal inside with their hollow and desperate threats. I did not bother watching the floor indicator numbers drop. I simply turned on my heel and walked back into the sprawling warmth of the penthouse suite. The legal team followed immediately behind me, dispersing efficiently across the expansive living area to set up their secure mobile workstations on the glass dining table. 10 miles away in a high-rise glass office, Jamal was not admitting defeat. A man fueled entirely by narcissism and a fragile ego does not surrender when cornered. He retaliates with whatever weapons he still possesses. Stripped of his ability to use the Vanguard trust funds and humiliated in front of law enforcement, he turned to his remaining influence in the corporate tech sector. He stormed into his luxury corner office, slamming the heavy glass door shut and ordering his assistants to hold all calls. He sat at his mahogany desk, furiously drafting a malicious, industry-wide advisory email. He blasted this email to every major tech recruiter, venture capital firm, and startup incubator in his extensive contact list. He framed the message as a highly confidential professional warning, claiming I was a severe corporate liability. He branded me a disgruntled thief who stole proprietary code from his developers. He described me as a mentally unstable employee, prone to violent outbursts, and warned that I was a toxic presence who would systematically destroy any development team from the inside out. He deployed his elite network to ensure that my name became absolute poison in the user interface and user experience design industry. He wanted to crush my livelihood completely, hoping I would be forced to crawl back to my family, begging for financial mercy. The results of his campaign were nearly instantaneous. I was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse looking out over the sprawling city skyline, when my newly issued encrypted smartphone began to vibrate continuously in my hand. The screen lit up with a rapid succession of automated notifications. They were rejection emails. Startups I had interviewed with weeks ago suddenly rescinded their final round offers without explanation. Tech firms that had previously praised my portfolio sent cold automated messages stating they were moving in a different direction. A headhunter I had known for years sent a brief apologetic text message warning me that a massive blacklisting campaign had just hit the executive inboxes across the city. I was officially locked out of the tech industry. My professional reputation had been dismantled in less than an hour. The old me, the woman who had cried in the freezing snow just 12 hours ago, would have completely panicked. I would have felt the crushing weight of a destroyed career and collapsed onto the floor in despair. But standing in the luxury penthouse, holding a titanium executive card that controlled a 51% stake in a multi-billion-dollar empire, the barrage of rejection emails felt entirely meaningless. I did not need a job designing user interfaces for mid-level tech firms anymore. I owned the capital that funded those exact same firms. Jamal was trying to lock me out of a house that I already owned. I ignored the vibrating phone and walked over to the massive glass dining table. I opened the high-end laptop the Vanguard legal team had provided for my personal use. Mr. Henderson had already routed the preliminary data from the blindside financial audit his forensic accountants were currently running on Jamal's hedge fund. The compliance officers had executed the lockdown perfectly. Jamal's servers were frozen, and every single digital ledger was being mirrored directly to my secure terminal in real time. I stared at the raw financial data flooding the high-resolution screen. To a layman, it was just an endless, chaotic cascade of spreadsheets, margin calls, and investment portfolio ratios. It was designed to look incredibly complex and intimidating, but I was not a layman. I was a senior systems architect. My entire career was built on organizing chaotic data structures into clear, comprehensible visual patterns. I understood how digital systems were built, how information was routed, and more importantly, how developers attempted to hide structural flaws behind overly complex, distracting interfaces. I did not read the numbers like a traditional accountant. I mapped the data flow exactly like a systems designer building a digital framework. I imported the raw ledgers into a visual mapping software, creating a real-time architectural blueprint of Jamal's entire hedge fund. I assigned color values to the different data streams to track the user journey of the capital. The green lines represented incoming funds from wealthy investors. The blue lines represented secured tangible assets. The red lines mapped out his leveraged debts and outgoing operational costs. At first glance, the system looked robust and incredibly healthy. The interface Jamal had designed for his quarterly investor reports projected massive growth and absolute stability. He had built a beautiful, convincing facade that blinded anyone who only looked at the surface-level metrics. But as I stripped away the superficial layers of the visual data, isolating the back-end routing paths, the entire structure began to look fundamentally wrong. I noticed a massive anomaly in the red outgoing lines. There was a dense, incredibly heavy cluster of data packets routed through a digital bottleneck, disguised as standard administrative overhead and operational consulting fees. Jamal had buried these transactions deep within the daily operational expenses, scattering them across thousands of microtransfers to avoid triggering automated banking flags or raising suspicion during casual reviews. I highlighted the dense cluster and commanded the mapping software to isolate the destination routing numbers. The screen recalibrated, linking the thousands of microtransfers back together into one massive continuous data stream. The green incoming capital from his investors was not going into the secure assets portfolio at all. It was being systematically siphoned directly into a hidden, deeply encrypted offshore routing network. I watched the isolated red line grow thicker and heavier on the screen, representing millions upon millions of dollars actively hemorrhaging from his firm. He was using newly acquired investor capital to quietly pay off massive, previously concealed liabilities. Jamal was not a financial genius managing a top-tier hedge fund. He was bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate, constructing a desperate, highly illegal illusion to hide a colossal financial black hole. My encrypted smartphone vibrated sharply against the thick glass surface of the dining table, pulling my attention away from the catastrophic data streams of Jamal's failing hedge fund. A high-resolution image loaded onto the bright screen. It was a close-up shot of my sister's pale wrist, adorned with a standard-issue white hospital identification bracelet. Beneath the photo, a block of frantic, emotionally charged text appeared. "Kelsey, please." The message began dripping with engineered desperation. "The stress of you attacking Jamal with the police today sent my blood pressure through the roof. The doctors say the baby is in severe distress. I am in the emergency room right now. If you have any shred of a heart left, just sign over the trust so our family can heal and my baby can be safe." In user experience design, we study the psychological pathways that force a user into a specific predetermined action. We call them dark patterns. For 33 years, this exact brand of emotional warfare had been my family's most effective dark pattern. Whenever Richard, Catherine, or Brittany needed to force my immediate compliance, they manufactured a severe crisis. If I refused to lend Brittany money in my 20s, Catherine would suddenly develop terrifying heart palpitations. If I pushed back against Richard's arrogant insults, Brittany would burst into hysterical tears, claiming my toxic energy was triggering a depressive episode. They relied entirely on my empathy, my anxiety, and my deeply ingrained guilt to keep me perfectly aligned with their selfish demands. Yesterday, a text message like this would have completely shattered me. I would have dropped everything, hailed a cab to the nearest emergency room, and begged for their forgiveness on my hands and knees. I would have traded my own future just to ensure my unborn niece or nephew was safe. But the frightened woman who had shivered in the freezing snow last night was dead. I was no longer operating on blind emotion, I was operating on verified data. I zoomed in on the photograph. As a designer, my entire career revolved around visual details, lighting composition, and spatial awareness. The lighting in the photograph simply did not match the harsh, sterile fluorescent glare of an emergency room triage bay. The background was intentionally blurred, but the color palette featured warm, muted earth tones and soft ambient shadows. Furthermore, the paper hospital bracelet looked slightly worn at the edges. The printed barcode was visibly faded from previous exposure to soap and water. I did not reply to Brittany. I did not offer frantic apologies or surrender my grandfather's legacy to a man who had just tried to have me arrested. Instead, I turned my attention to Evelyn Carter, the senior corporate counsel who had accompanied Mr. Henderson to my penthouse suite. She was currently reviewing Jamal's frozen accounts on her own secure tablet, her posture projecting absolute authority. "Evelyn," I said, my voice completely devoid of panic. "My sister is claiming she has been admitted to the emergency room due to severe pregnancy complications caused by my actions. She is actively leveraging this medical crisis to demand I surrender my controlling interest in the Vanguard Trust." Evelyn looked up, her expression hardening into absolute professional focus. "Are you requesting a wellness check, Miss Kelsey, or a fraud investigation?" "Both," I replied smoothly. "Does the trust retain private investigators with rapid deployment capabilities?" "We retain the finest corporate intelligence firm in the city," Evelyn confirmed, already tapping her communication earpiece to open a secure channel. "They have field agents stationed throughout the downtown sector. Where does your sister claim to be?" Brittany had not specified a hospital. This was a classic manipulation tactic designed to induce panic and force the victim to call and beg for details. I instructed Evelyn to run a geographic trace on the metadata attached to the original photograph Brittany had just texted me. The Vanguard intelligence team intercepted the digital footprint in a matter of seconds, locking onto my sister's exact GPS coordinates. I turned back to the massive architectural map of Jamal's collapsing finances on my laptop. The red lines representing his hidden debts were growing thicker by the minute as the forensic auditors dug deeper into his offshore routing numbers. He was entirely desperate, and he was clearly using his pregnant wife as a human shield to force a massive transfer of wealth. I drank a glass of iced water, feeling nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I would not allow their emotional extortion to derail my focus. Exactly 20 minutes later, Evelyn walked over to the glass table. She did not look distressed or concerned. She looked entirely victorious. She placed a high-resolution, full-color tablet directly over the financial charts I had been studying. "Our field investigator secured a visual confirmation," Miss Kelsey Evelyn stated, a sharp edge of immense satisfaction in her professional tone. "Your sister is not in an emergency room, and she is certainly not experiencing any medical distress." I looked down at the live geotagged photograph the investigator had just transmitted. The image was crystal clear. Brittany was not lying in a sterile hospital bed surrounded by beeping heart monitors. She was lounging in a plush, oversized velvet reclining chair at the Serenity Falls Luxury Day Spa, one of the most exclusive and expensive wellness centers in the entire financial district. She was wearing a thick, luxurious white spa robe. A technician was actively massaging her feet and applying a fresh coat of pastel pink polish to her toenails. On the small, polished bamboo table next to her recliner sat a tall crystal glass of sparkling water, garnished with a slice of fresh cucumber and a sprig of mint. Her face, which had supposedly been contorted in agonizing pain just 20 minutes ago, was glowing with relaxed, arrogant satisfaction as she rapidly scrolled through her smartphone. And there, loosely fastened around her right wrist as she texted, was the exact same faded white hospital bracelet from the photograph. She had clearly saved the paper band from a routine, perfectly healthy ultrasound checkup months ago, keeping it in her purse as a convenient prop for this exact type of emotional blackmail. I placed the high-resolution tablet face down on the thick glass of the dining table. I did not type out an angry reply to my sister. I did not block her number. I simply let her believe her emotional extortion was working, leaving her to stew in the agonizing silence while I went back to my work. The absolute audacity of her deception was staggering, but it gave me exactly what I needed. It entirely freed me from any lingering trace of familial guilt. With my sister's charade fully exposed, I shifted my focus back to the forensic audit, glowing brightly on my laptop screen. The forensic auditors dispatched by Mr. Henderson had successfully cracked the encryption on the offshore routing numbers. The data packets that Jamal had desperately tried to camouflage as standard operational consulting fees and administrative overhead were finally unmasked. I used my design software to track the exact flow of his stolen capital across international borders, watching the red lines converge into a single undeniable point of failure. He had spent months mocking my profession, claiming my user interface designs were worthless. Yet it was precisely my expertise in tracking user behavior, recognizing digital patterns, and identifying structural anomalies that allowed me to tear his entire financial facade to shreds in a matter of hours. He had built a sloppy, desperate digital trail leaving massive footprints across secure networks, because he arrogantly believed no one in our family possessed the technical literacy to catch him. The money was not going into secure tax havens. It was not funding legitimate subsidiary investments or corporate acquisitions. The receiving accounts were directly linked to a notorious syndicate operating out of the Caribbean and Southeast Asia, an organization specializing exclusively in high-stakes underground gambling. Jamal was not a brilliant financial mind who had fallen victim to a volatile market. He was a degenerate gambler who had leveraged his entire corporate reputation on a series of catastrophic bets. When the market turned against him and the syndicates demanded their money, he did not face his losses with any dignity. Instead, he started actively siphoning millions of dollars directly from his elite investors to secretly cover his massive outstanding margin calls. But the corporate theft was only the first layer of his profound desperation. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. I filtered the audit logs by local asset liquidation, searching for the source of a massive sudden cash injection Jamal had secured just 3 weeks prior to Christmas. A scanned PDF document populated on my high-end monitor. It was a heavily expedited commercial loan agreement. Jamal had secured a high-interest short-term cash advance from a predatory private lender. I scrolled down to examine the collateral listed on the loan, and my blood ran completely cold. He had used the suburban estate, the very house where Richard and Catherine slept every night, the sprawling home they proudly and loudly claimed to own, to all their country club friends, had been put up as leverage. Jamal had somehow bypassed the standard title checks, likely utilizing a corrupt loan officer within his network, and explicitly forged Richard and Catherine's signatures on the documents to illegally remortgage the property. He had bet the family home to pay off his gambling debts, entirely willing to let his in-laws face sudden foreclosure the second he defaulted. The sheer blinding arrogance of his crime was breathtaking. Jamal thought he was stealing from his gullible, status-obsessed in-laws. He thought he was outsmarting Richard and Catherine. He had absolutely no idea that my parents never held the actual deed to the property. He had just attempted to illegally mortgage an estate fully and legally owned by the Theodore Vanguard Trust. He had essentially tried to rob a multi-billion-dollar financial fortress using amateur forged signatures. The federal bank fraud alone carried a mandatory prison sentence that would lock him away for decades. I kept digging into his personal liquidation logs, scrolling past records of sold luxury sports cars and quietly liquidated stock options. An entry from exactly 6 months ago caught my eye. It was a digital receipt from a high-end, highly discreet pawnbroker located 2 towns over. I opened the scanned receipt and carefully examined the item description. It listed a platinum-set high-clarity diamond tennis necklace. My mind immediately flashed back to the freezing porch on Christmas Eve. I heard Brittany's hysterical voice echoing sharply in my memory, screaming that I had stolen the diamond tennis necklace Jamal had given her that very morning. She had clutched her bare collarbone, crying tears of manufactured anguish, while Jamal wrapped a protective arm around her, playing the role of the furious, supportive husband. I pulled up the insurance documents stored in Jamal's personal files and cross-referenced the serial number of the insured diamonds with the serial number explicitly listed on the pawnshop receipt. It was an exact, undeniable match. Jamal had not bought Brittany a new diamond necklace for Christmas. He had pawned the real insured diamonds 6 months ago to feed his spiraling gambling addiction. He had replaced the priceless heirloom with a cheap cubic zirconia fake. When the time came to kick me out into the snow and secure his absolute control over the household, he had orchestrated the perfect devastating distraction. He used me as the convenient scapegoat for a theft that had actually occurred half a year prior, executed by his very own hand. I watched the digital map of Jamal's financial ruin glow on my high-resolution monitor, the undeniable proof of his stolen diamonds and massive offshore gambling debts permanently saved to my secure servers. Now I needed to see exactly how my parents would react to the sudden, unexplained freezing of their pristine financial ecosystem. Richard and Catherine were flailing blindly in the dark. The Vanguard forensic audit had completely severed their access to the trust's overflow dividends. Their platinum cards were useless blocks of plastic, and their exclusive country club accounts were suspended pending payment. Rather than face reality or ask the hard questions about where their money had gone, they chose the path of absolute aggressive denial. Jamal, increasingly desperate to secure fresh capital to cover his bleeding margin calls before his underground creditors came collecting, convinced my parents that a massive, ostentatious display of wealth was the only way to attract new elite investors to his sinking hedge fund. He preyed on their deepest insecurities, whispering that showing any sign of financial weakness would ruin their social standing forever. They decided to throw the most lavish New Year's Eve gala our wealthy suburban neighborhood had ever seen. Catherine poured her entire manic energy into the event. She envisioned an evening dripping in baccarat crystal, imported beluga caviar, and towers of vintage champagne. She wanted a live string quartet playing in the grand foyer, a massive custom ice sculpture in the shape of Jamal's corporate logo, and a towering fireworks display to ring in the new year. It was a calculated, desperate theatrical performance designed to project absolute stability, while their actual financial foundation crumbled to dust beneath their expensive Italian leather shoes. But a performance of that magnitude requires liquid cash, something Jamal and my parents no longer possessed. Through my secure Vanguard terminal, I tracked Richard's frantic digital footprints across the banking sector. Denied by every major financial institution due to the sudden asset freeze and his lack of actual collateral, my father resorted to the absolute bottom of the financial barrel. He secured a series of predatory high-interest short-term loans. He was literally borrowing money at ruinous, borderline extortionate interest rates from hard money lenders just to buy expensive appetizers and hire private valet drivers. It was financial suicide deliberately disguised as a holiday celebration. I did not interfere with his disastrous loans. I sat back and let him dig the hole as deep as he possibly could. But a high society gala requires service contracts, and in the corporate world, contracts can easily be bought. I tasked Mr. Henderson with identifying the exact event management company, the luxury catering service, the audiovisual technicians, and the private security firm my parents had hired for the evening. Richard had only paid the preliminary minimum deposits to secure the dates, aggressively promising the desperate vendors that the remaining massive balances would be settled in cash on the night of the event. I instructed Evelyn Carter, our senior corporate counsel, to contact every single vendor directly on my behalf. We paid all their outstanding invoices in full, immediately transferring the service contracts entirely under the name of the Theodore Vanguard Trust. By executing that simple financial maneuver, I became the sole legal employer of the catering staff pouring the champagne, the event planners organizing the schedule, the technicians running the sound system, and most importantly, the elite private security detail stationed at the front gates of my property. I arranged a secure video call with the head of the security firm later that afternoon. I provided him with a very specific, undeniable set of instructions for how the evening was to proceed. I sent his legal department the verified property deeds, proving the Vanguard Trust owned the estate, and I authorized a substantial hazard bonus for his team's absolute compliance with my upcoming directives. My parents thought that they were hosting the event of the season, a masterclass in social climbing that would secure Jamal's fake empire. They had absolutely no idea they had just walked into a fully operational, legally binding trap that I controlled entirely from the top down. The days leading up to December 31st moved with rapid, calculated precision. Jamal continued to send out his frantic, defamatory emails about my professional reputation to the tech industry, completely oblivious to the fact that his own federal arrest warrants were currently being finalized by financial regulators based on the audit data I had surrendered to the authorities. Brittany continued her fake spa day text messages, playing the distressed pregnant victim, begging me to surrender my grandfather's legacy to save her blood pressure. I ignored all of it, focusing entirely on the architecture of their impending public ruin. On the evening of New Year's Eve, the city outside my penthouse window was alive with electric anticipation. Snow fell softly over the financial district, reflecting the bright, vibrant lights of the skyline against the dark winter sky. I stood in front of the gilded full-length mirror in the master bedroom, analyzing my reflection. I did not wear a festive, glittering gown or sparkling holiday jewelry. I wore a masterfully tailored midnight blue executive suit. The sharp, structured shoulders and crisp lines projected unyielding, cold authority. I adjusted the lapels of my blazer, my expression cool, analytical, and entirely composed. I was not attending this gala as a disgraced, disappointed daughter begging for a second chance at a family dinner. I was not the unemployed designer they had shoved into the freezing street just 1 week ago with nothing but a broken laptop. I stepped away from the mirror and picked up the heavy brass key Grandpa Theodore had given me. I was stepping through those mahogany doors tonight as the absolute majority shareholder, the chief creditor of their fraudulent lives, and the undisputed landlord of the very ground they stood on. The suburban estate had been transformed into a garish monument to financial desperation. A fleet of hired valets hustled down the snow-covered driveway, parking an endless stream of luxury vehicles for the city elite. Inside the grand foyer, a live string quartet played classical music that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. A massive custom ice sculpture of Jamal's corporate logo dominated the center of the main ballroom, slowly dripping freezing water onto a silver collection tray. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated through the dense crowd of high society guests, carrying silver platters piled high with imported beluga caviar and towering flutes of vintage champagne. Every single element of the lavish display was funded by the ruinous high-interest payday loans my father had desperately secured just days prior. It was a fragile, glittering house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind. Near the sweeping grand staircase, Jamal was loudly holding court. He was surrounded by a tight circle of older, wealthy venture capitalists and prominent angel investors. He held a high-resolution tablet in his hand, projecting the display onto a large, flat-screen monitor set up specifically for his presentation. He was aggressively pitching a revolutionary new trading platform. He swiped smoothly through the digital dashboard, boasting about the seamless user journey and the intuitive predictive analytics interface. He claimed he had architected the entire digital environment from scratch. He bragged about his visionary approach to financial technology, soaking up the impressed nods of the wealthy men holding their checkbooks. I knew exactly how seamless that user interface was because I had spent the last 2 years designing every single pixel of it. The color gradients, the data visualization architecture, the precise placement of the navigation menus. It was entirely my stolen intellectual property, repackaged and rebranded under his failing hedge fund. A few feet away, Catherine was busy working the room. She stood with a group of prominent socialite wives, gesturing grandly with her crystal champagne flute. She boasted loudly about her brilliant son-in-law, claiming Jamal was on the verge of reshaping the entire global financial market. She praised Richard for his unmatched real estate acumen, sweeping her hand around the grand ballroom to emphasize the sheer scale of the house they supposedly owned. Brittany stood right beside her wearing a designer maternity gown and playing the role of the glowing, expectant mother. She smiled coyly as the older women complimented the massive glittering tennis necklace resting against her collarbone. None of them knew it was a cheap cubic zirconia replica, just like none of them knew the caviar they were eating was bought with money borrowed from predatory lenders. The heavy mahogany front doors of the estate suddenly swung open with a resounding thud. A sharp blast of freezing winter wind swept directly into the overheated grand foyer, extinguishing the decorative candles lined along the entryway. I stepped over the threshold and into the bright light of the grand hall. I did not wear a glittering evening gown. I wore the midnight blue tailored executive suit. My posture was perfectly straight, projecting an aura of absolute cold authority. I was not alone. To my immediate right stood Mr. Henderson, the senior branch manager of Vanguard Private Wealth. He carried a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm, his expression a mask of uncompromising corporate seriousness. To my immediate left stood two fully uniformed city police officers. Their presence was not aggressive, but it was undeniably official. They stood tall, their hands resting comfortably near their utility belts, their eyes scanning the opulent room. The impact of our arrival was instantaneous. The lead violinist of the string quartet faltered, his bow scraping harshly against the strings before the music died out completely. The lively hum of 100 conversations evaporated into thin air. The clinking of crystal glasses stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the entire ballroom as every single guest turned to stare at the front entrance. Richard spotted me first. The color drained entirely from his face before rushing back in an angry, mottled purple flush. Catherine gasped aloud, her hand flying up to cover her mouth, nearly spilling her vintage champagne onto her expensive silk dress. Brittany shrank back against a marble pillar, her eyes darting nervously toward the uniformed police officers. Jamal turned away from his presentation monitor, his arrogant smile instantly twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Seeing his wealthy investors looking confused and alarmed, his fragile ego took full control. He completely misread the situation. He assumed I was a desperate, bitter woman trying to cause a scene to ruin his pitch, completely blind to the corporate reality standing right beside me. He handed his presentation tablet to a nearby assistant and marched aggressively across the polished hardwood floor toward the foyer. His heavy footsteps echoed in the dead silence of the ballroom. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my face, projecting his voice loudly so his wealthy audience could hear him taking command. "Security!" Jamal roared, his voice bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "I want this trespasser thrown out of my house immediately. She is a disgruntled former employee trying to cause a disturbance. Grab her and drag her out into the snow right now." He snapped his fingers aggressively at the elite private security team stationed just inside the grand foyer. The security personnel were highly trained professionals, dressed in immaculate dark suits with discreet communication earpieces. They were muscular, intimidating, and positioned specifically to handle severe disruptions. Jamal crossed his arms over his broad chest, lifting his chin fully, expecting the guards to descend on me, grab my arms, and violently eject me in front of the entire high society crowd. He waited for the absolute humiliation he felt I deserved. The security guards did not move an inch. The captain of the private security detail, a tall man with a stern, weathered face, took a single step forward. He did not look at Jamal. He did not look at the furious, red-faced Richard, who was now marching up behind his son-in-law. The captain looked directly past them, locking his eyes squarely on me. He slowly raised his hands and crossed his arms firmly over his chest. He planted his feet wide, adopting a stance of absolute unmoving stillness. His entire team mirrored his exact movement, locking their hands behind their backs and standing at attention. They did not reach for me. They did not even flinch at Jamal's screaming commands. They simply stood their ground, looking right past the man who thought he had hired them, waiting in total silence for my direct orders. Jamal's face flushed with a dangerous, volatile mix of extreme embarrassment and absolute fury. He lunged toward the captain of the security detail, aggressively jabbing his thick finger directly at the man's chest. "Are you completely deaf?" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking under the intense strain. "I am the host of this event. I pay your salaries. Grab this woman right now, or I will make sure your firm never works a single contract in this city again." The captain did not even blink. He maintained his rigid professional stance, completely ignoring the screaming hedge fund manager. His eyes remained locked straight ahead, completely unbothered by the empty threats. I walked right past Jamal. I did not brush his shoulder or acknowledge his proximity. I moved with purposeful, fluid steps toward the elevated stage where the string quartet had been playing just minutes before. I reached out and took the primary microphone from its heavy iron stand. The sharp squeal of audio feedback pierced the silent ballroom, causing several high society guests to wince and cover their ears. "Actually, Jamal," I said, my voice projecting crystal clear through the state-of-the-art surround sound system, "you do not pay their salaries. The Theodore Vanguard Trust paid their invoices in full yesterday morning. Just like the trust paid for the crystal on these tables, the imported caviar your guests are currently eating, and the valet parking outside. You are completely broke. You funded this entire pathetic charade using predatory payday loans that you cannot afford to pay back." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy investors. Whispers broke out instantly among the elite socialites. Furthermore, I continued pacing slowly across the edge of the stage. "The Vanguard Trust also owns the proprietary source code you are currently pitching to these venture capitalists. You fired me to steal my user interface architecture, but you were too arrogant to realize the patents were securely registered to my private holding company months before your firm acquired the startup. You are standing in my house, eating my food, guarded by my security, and pitching my software." Jamal's eyes darted frantically around the room. He could see the wealthy angel investors exchanging alarmed glances. He raised his hands, adopting a desperate, placating tone. "Listen to her," Jamal pleaded to the crowd, his voice taking on a frantic edge. "She is completely unstable. This is exactly what I warned everyone about in my industry emails. Do not listen to a single word this delusional woman says." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to shout over his frantic lies. I simply looked up toward the soundproof glass of the audiovisual control booth perched on the second-floor balcony. I gave a single sharp nod to the lead technician. The massive, high-definition LED screen positioned right behind Jamal abruptly cut out. The slick, stolen user interface of his trading platform vanished into total blackness. A second later, the screen flared back to life with blinding, undeniable clarity. The first document to flash across the 15-foot display was a highly detailed forensic audit map. The red routing lines clearly traced millions of dollars flowing directly from his elite investor capital accounts into offshore syndicates. "You are not a financial visionary, Jamal," I announced, my voice echoing coldly over the speakers. "You are a degenerate gambler. You have been actively siphoning investor capital to cover catastrophic underground betting debts in the Caribbean." The investors in the front row stared at the screen in absolute horror. One older venture capitalist immediately pulled out his smartphone, furiously dialing his wealth manager to halt any pending wire transfers. Another investor grabbed his coat from a nearby chair, shaking his head in pure disgust as he realized how close he had come to funding a massive criminal enterprise. Before Jamal could even open his mouth to deny the gambling syndicates, the massive screen transitioned to the next document. It was a heavily expedited commercial loan agreement featuring the exact address of the suburban estate we were currently standing in. At the bottom of the page were 2 digital signatures belonging to my father and my mother. "To cover your bleeding margin calls," I continued, locking eyes with Richard and Catherine, who were now trembling near the melting ice sculpture. "You took out an illegal, high-interest mortgage on this very house. You forged Richard and Catherine's signatures to bet their home on your failing gambling debts. What you did not realize, Jamal, is that Richard and Catherine do not own this property. The Vanguard Trust owns it. You committed federal bank fraud attempting to mortgage an estate you had absolutely zero legal rights to." Richard let out a strangled, breathless sound. He grabbed his chest, staggering backward as the reality of his son-in-law's ultimate betrayal set in. Catherine looked like she was going to be physically sick, right onto the polished hardwood floor. Her perfect socialite image was entirely shattered. The LED screen shifted one final time. A scanned high-resolution digital receipt from a discreet local pawnbroker appeared in bright, glaring colors. The item description clearly listed a platinum-set, high-clarity diamond tennis necklace. The date on the receipt was stamped exactly 6 months ago. And finally, I said, dropping my gaze to Brittany, who was standing frozen in her designer maternity gown. "You threw me out into the freezing snow on Christmas Eve, claiming I stole your precious diamonds." But as everyone can clearly see on the screen, Jamal pawned the real insured diamonds half a year ago to feed his addiction. The necklace you are wearing right now is a cheap cubic zirconia fake. You framed me for a theft your own husband committed to orchestrate the perfect distraction. The ballroom erupted into absolute chaos. Wealthy socialites backed away from Brittany in pure disdain. Angel investors were physically shouting into their phones, aggressively canceling their funding rounds, and demanding their initial capital be returned immediately. The glittering, perfectly curated illusion of wealth and prestige was violently and irreversibly shattered into a million pieces right before their eyes. Jamal turned chalk white. The arrogant, booming voice he used to command boardrooms completely vanished. He stumbled backward, his expensive Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the polished floor. He looked at the damning evidence glowing brightly on the massive screen behind him, his breathing shallow and erratic. He turned to look at the exit, visibly calculating if he could make a run for the front doors. He never made it a single step. The two uniformed city police officers moved forward with practiced, synchronized precision. They unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts, the harsh metallic clinking sound cutting sharply through the frantic noise of the ruined gala. "Jamal is under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and forging property deeds," the lead officer announces, snapping the heavy steel cuffs onto Jamal's wrists, right in front of the lavish caviar station. Brittany screams a shrill, piercing sound that cuts through the grand ballroom. She drops her vintage champagne flute. The expensive crystal shatters loudly against the polished hardwood floor, sending shards of glass and vintage champagne splashing across the pristine marble tiles. The glittering pieces scatter wildly, catching the bright overhead lights and sparkling exactly like the fake cubic zirconia necklace resting heavily against her collarbone. Jamal thrashes against the officer's firm grip. His expensive tailored coat bunches awkwardly around his shoulders as his arms are forced behind his back. He knocks a massive silver serving platter off the table, sending imported appetizers tumbling to the floor in a messy pile. He shouts desperately to the wealthy investors standing just a few feet away. He begs them to listen, promising he can explain the data anomalies, claiming it is a massive corporate misunderstanding engineered by a bitter ex-employee. But the officers do not care about his desperate sales pitch. They read him his Miranda rights with practiced mechanical efficiency, utterly unimpressed by his luxury watch or the opulent suburban surroundings. The wealthy guests actively retreat. The elite venture capitalists and prominent angel investors pull their expensive winter coats tightly around their shoulders, making an immediate and desperate exodus toward the front doors. No one wants to be photographed by the media at the epicenter of a massive federal financial raid. The string quartet has completely packed up their instruments, fleeing silently through the servants' entrance. The grand New Year's Eve gala has officially transformed into a massive, undeniable crime scene. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos freeze in place, unsure of whether to clear the ruined food or simply walk away from the disaster unfolding in the grand foyer. Catherine watches her entire social standing evaporate in less than 3 minutes. The prominent socialite wives she had been boasting to just moments ago now refuse to even make eye contact with her, whispering furiously behind their hands as they hurry out the massive double doors. Her perfectly curated illusion of wealth is completely dead. Richard cannot process the reality unfolding in front of him. The denial that has fueled his entire existence violently overrides any sense of logic or self-preservation. He completely ignores the glaring evidence of Jamal's crimes glowing on the massive LED screen. He blames the person who exposed the truth. He balls his hands into tight fists, his face turning a dangerous shade of mottled crimson, and charges directly at me. "You vindictive monster!" Richard roars, his voice cracking with unhinged, desperate fury. "You set up your own brother-in-law. You are destroying this family over a petty grudge." The private security captain immediately steps into Richard's path. The tall, broad-shouldered guard plants a heavy, immovable hand squarely on my father's chest, halting his aggressive advance before he can close the distance between us. Richard struggles wildly against the guard's grip, his eyes wild, spit flying from his lips as he continues to shout baseless accusations. Catherine rushes to his side, her designer silk dress rustling sharply against the hardwood floor. She grabs Richard's arm not to calm him down but to join the vicious verbal attack. "You could have come to us privately," Catherine hisses, her face twisted in a mask of pure hatred. "If you really found these documents, you should have shown them to the family. We could have fixed this quietly. We could have handled the bank without involving the authorities. But no, you had to make a public spectacle to feed your own jealousy. You are sick, Kelsey. You are completely deranged." I stand perfectly still. I do not flinch at Richard's aggressive physical lunge. I do not shrink back from Catherine's venomous, hypocritical accusations. I look at them with the cold, calculating detachment of a forensic auditor reviewing a failed bankrupt account. The freezing winter wind blows through the open front doors, swirling the delicate snowflakes into the heated entryway, but the chill does not affect me. I am entirely protected by the armor of absolute truth. "I did not set up anyone, Dad," I state, my voice projecting clearly and calmly over the chaotic noise of Jamal being physically dragged out the front doors by the police officers. "I did not force Jamal to siphon millions of dollars from his investors to pay off Caribbean gambling syndicates. I did not force him to pawn his wife's jewelry and buy fake diamonds. And I certainly did not force him to forge your signature on an illegal commercial mortgage document. All I did was turn on the lights so everyone could finally see the rats scattering in the dark." Brittany collapses onto a velvet settee near the grand staircase, sobbing hysterically as she watches the police shove her disgraced husband into the back of a squad car parked on the snow-covered driveway. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruiser illuminate the high vaulted windows of the foyer, casting eerie shadows across the ruined party. She looks up at me, her expensive makeup running down her cheeks in dark, messy streaks. "He is my husband," Brittany wails, clutching her stomach in a desperate bid for sympathy. "He is the father of my baby. How am I supposed to survive now? You took absolutely everything from me." "You took everything from me on Christmas Eve," I remind her, my tone completely devoid of any familial sympathy. "You faked a robbery to ensure I was thrown out into the freezing snow with absolutely nothing. You lied to the police, you lied to our parents, and you sent me fake hospital pictures from a luxury day spa to try and extort my inheritance. You built your entire life on a foundation of absolute lies, Brittany. Do not blame me, because the foundation finally collapsed under its own weight." Richard manages to shove the security guard's arm away, taking one defiant, arrogant step closer to me. He points a trembling finger directly at my face, attempting to channel the tyrannical authority he wielded just 1 week ago on the icy porch. "You listen to me," Richard snarls, trying desperately to reclaim his lost power. "You might have ruined Jamal's career with your computer tricks, but you are not touching us. I built this life. I bought this house. We are going to hire the best defense attorneys in the entire state. We are going to sue you for corporate espionage, defamation, and emotional distress. You will never set foot on this property again." I do not break eye contact. The sheer delusion required for him to still believe he holds any power in this room is almost fascinating to witness. He truly believes his arrogant bluster can alter verified legal reality. He still thinks he is the undisputed king of a castle, completely blind to the fact that the castle walls have already been legally repossessed. I reach smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my tailored midnight blue blazer. I bypass the heavy black metal Vanguard card and wrap my fingers around a thick, tightly bound stack of legal documents Evelyn Carter handed to me just before we entered the ballroom. I pull out the thick, red-stamped legal folder. I step forward, bypassing the security guard entirely, and slam the heavy folder down onto the nearest catering table right next to the ruined melting ice sculpture. The sharp, violent smack of the heavy cardstock hitting the mahogany table echoes like a gunshot through the rapidly emptying grand foyer. I did not forge his gambling debts, Dad, I say, my voice echoing clearly through the massive and silent ballroom. I did not invent his offshore wire transfers, and I certainly did not force him to steal from his own investors to cover his massive margin calls. You gave your absolute loyalty to a criminal simply because he wore a heavy gold watch and leased a luxury car. But since you want to talk about destroying things, let us talk about this house. Catherine lets out a harsh and mocking sound. She steps forward, crossing her arms defensively over her designer silk gown. Do not be ridiculous, Kelsey. This is our home. Richard bought this estate. We built this life from the ground up, and no amount of your insane and jealous computer hacking is going to change the fact that we own this property. I look at my mother, marveling at the sheer depth of her absolute delusion. She has repeated the lie so many times over the past 3 years that she actually believes it to be historical fact. Richard did not buy this house. I state, my tone dropping to a cold and clinical register. Grandpa Theodore bought it. He paid for every single brick, every marble tile, and every blade of grass on this property. And because he knew exactly how reckless and status-obsessed you both were, he never put your names on the deed. He put the entire estate into the Theodore Vanguard Trust. You have been living here as glorified tenants surviving on a heavily restricted operational allowance generated by the dividends of his actual investments. That is a complete lie, Richard shouts, his face turning an even darker shade of purple. My father died a bankrupt failure. He lost everything in the market crash. I salvaged this estate from his financial ruin. I am the master of this house. I place my hand flat on top of the red-stamped legal folder resting on the catering table. I open the heavy cardstock cover, revealing a pristine and legally binding stack of verified property deeds and trust ownership documents. Evelyn Carter steps forward, tapping her manicured finger directly onto the raised and notarized seal of the state. Theodore Vanguard did not lose a single cent in any market crash. Evelyn explains, her professional voice cutting through Richard's frantic shouting. He orchestrated a brilliant and highly secure financial restructuring to protect his core capital from his own heirs. He deliberately created a completely isolated wealth management ecosystem. Your occupancy of this estate was strictly contingent on the goodwill of the primary trust beneficiary. I pull the master property deed from the folder. I hold it up so the bright and glaring light of the crystal chandelier illuminates the bold black ink printed across the top of the heavy parchment. Jamal tried to illegally mortgage this exact property to cover his Caribbean gambling losses, I say, my eyes locking onto Richard's terrified face. He forged your signatures on a commercial loan document to bet this house against his massive financial black hole. But his fraudulent mortgage bounced the second it hit the federal registry because he tried to leverage an estate that does not belong to you. The true and legal owner of this property is the individual holding the 51% controlling interest of Vanguard Holdings. I slide the heavy property deed across the mahogany catering table. The document glides smoothly over the polished wood, coming to a dead stop right next to Catherine's trembling hand. Read it, I command. Catherine stares down at the document. Her eyes scan the heavy legal text, tracking the certified property lines, the county seals, and the indisputable proof of ownership. Her breath catches sharply in her throat. Her manicured fingers shake violently as she reaches out, hovering just inches above the paper, as if touching it might cause her to physically burn. At the very top of the deed, printed in bold and undeniable typography, is my name. Kelsey Vanguard. No! Catherine gasps, her voice barely a whisper. She stumbles backward, her designer heels slipping slightly on a puddle of spilled vintage champagne. This is a mistake. This has to be a clerical mistake. Richard, tell them it is a mistake. Richard stares at this paper, his arrogant posture finally collapsing completely. His shoulders slump, and the belligerent fire in his eyes is entirely extinguished. It is rapidly replaced by the hollow and vacant stare of a man who just watched his entire fabricated reality disintegrate into absolute dust. The truth is an immovable wall, and he has just crashed into it at full speed. You kicked me out into the freezing snow on Christmas Eve, I say, stepping around the catering table and closing the distance between us. You threw my canvas bag into the street and told me I was a failure. You locked the deadbolt and laughed while I shivered in the sub-zero wind because you truly thought I was a parasite trying to feed off your success. I lean in closer, ensuring my voice is the only sound they hear in the ruined and empty ballroom. I am not a parasite. I am the landlord. Brittany lets out another hysterical sob from the velvet settee. She buries her face in her hands, the fake cubic zirconia necklace catching the light as her chest heaves. She finally understands that there is no rescue coming. There is no wealthy husband to bail her out, no rich parents to shelter her, and no golden child privilege to shield her from the devastating consequences of her own malicious actions. The silence that follows is profound. It is the heavy and absolute silence of total defeat. The grand New Year's Eve gala, built entirely on predatory loans and arrogant deception, has become a spectacular graveyard for their egos. The imported caviar sits abandoned on silver trays. The massive ice sculpture continues to melt into a puddle of dirty water. The elite private security team stands perfectly still, their loyalty secured entirely by my corporate authority. I stand tall in my midnight blue executive suit, feeling the immense and unyielding power of my grandfather's legacy flowing through me. I did not need to scream or cry or beg for their approval. I simply needed to let the truth speak for itself. Evelyn Carter checks her expensive wristwatch, her expression remaining completely impassive. She looks at Richard and Catherine, assessing their broken posture with the cold efficiency of a corporate shark. As the sole legal owner of this property, Evelyn states, addressing my parents directly, "My client has the absolute right to revoke your tenancy privileges, effective immediately. You are currently trespassing on a private estate owned by Vanguard Holdings." Richard slowly raises his head. His face is pale, his eyes wide with a sudden and desperate realization of what is about to happen next. "Kelsey, please," he begs, his voice cracking horribly. "You cannot do this. It is the middle of the night. It is freezing outside. We have nowhere to go. Jamal took everything we had left to fund this party. We do not have a single dollar to our names." Catherine reaches out, her trembling hands grasping the sleeve of my tailored blazer. "Kelsey, honey, listen to me. We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot just throw your own mother out into the winter night. Brittany is pregnant. She needs a warm bed. Please, I am begging you. Do not do this." I look down at her grasping fingers, feeling absolutely nothing but cold and clinical detachment. I reach out and firmly remove her hand from my sleeve, brushing the fabric smooth so no trace of her touch remains. "You beg for a warm bed and a roof over your head," I say, my voice steady and completely void of sympathy. "Just 1 week ago, you stood on that freezing porch and watched Jamal throw my belongings into the snow. You called me a parasite. You told me to grow up. You locked the deadbolt and turned off the porch lights while I shivered in the sub-zero wind." Catherine bursts into tears. Her immaculate socialite facade shatters entirely in front of the few remaining catering staff and security guards who stand witness to her total humiliation. She sinks to her knees on the polished hardwood, her designer gown pooling around her in the spilled champagne. She sobs openly, her wails echoing through the cavernous foyer, stripped of every ounce of dignity she had spent her life cultivating. Brittany frantically searches the room, her hands grasping at her fake diamonds. "Jamal." Brittany screams, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "Jamal, do something. Fix this right now. Tell them they cannot do this to us." But Jamal is no longer in any position to fix anything. Through the massive glass panes of the front doors, we all watch as the 2 city police officers aggressively march him down the icy, snow-covered driveway. His heavy tailored coat is bunched awkwardly around his handcuffed wrists. The officers force him to duck his head and shove him directly into the back of the police cruiser. The heavy metal door slams shut, sealing him inside. The flashing red and blue lights paint Brittany's horrified face in alternating colors of despair. "He is gone, Brittany," I state flatly. "Your husband is going to federal prison for a very long time, And he is leaving you with absolutely nothing but a fake necklace and a pile of catastrophic debt. I turn my attention back to Richard and Catherine. I check the gold watch on my wrist, the crisp, synchronized ticking of the second hand marking the end of their reign. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate my property, I announce, my voice ringing with absolute uncompromising authority. 10 minutes, Richard gasps, his eyes darting frantically around the grand ballroom. Kelsey, that is impossible. We need to pack our clothes. We need to gather our belongings. We have entire wardrobes, jewelry, furniture. You will take absolutely nothing, I interject, cutting off his frantic bargaining. You will leave with exactly what you are wearing right now. Every single item inside this house, the designer clothes in your closets, the luxury cars parked in the garage, the crystal glasses sitting on these tables, was purchased using stolen funds that rightfully belong to the Theodore Vanguard Trust. Every physical asset on this property is officially seized as of this exact moment to offset the massive financial damages you and Jamal inflicted upon my grandfather's estate. Catherine looks up from the floor, her makeup completely ruined. You cannot strip us bare. We will freeze. We do not even have our winter coats on. We are in evening wear. Evelyn Carter steps forward, her posture rigid. Miss Kelsey's orders are entirely lawful. The security team has already locked down the upper floors. You will not be permitted to access the master suites or the guest rooms. If you attempt to take any asset from this property, you will be immediately detained for theft. The private security captain signals his men. The guards move with rapid, synchronized precision, forming a solid human barricade at the base of the grand sweeping staircase, physically blocking any path to the bedrooms above. Brittany drops to the floor next to Catherine, weeping hysterically. She clutches her stomach, realizing her golden child status has entirely evaporated. She is no longer the pampered princess of the household. She is an accessory to fraud, married to a criminal and entirely destitute. Her fake medical emergencies and emotional manipulation tactics hold absolutely no power here. Richard stares at the solid wall of security guards, the realization finally sinking in that his tyranny is permanently over. The arrogance that fueled his entire existence drains from his body, leaving a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He takes a step toward me, his hands clasped together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of supplication. Kelsey, please. Richard begs, his voice trembling violently. His previous arrogance is completely gone, replaced by raw, humiliating desperation. Look outside. It is the middle of the night. The temperature is dropping fast. We have absolutely zero cash. We have no credit cards. We cannot even afford a cheap taxi. Just let us stay for one more night. Give us until morning to figure out a plan. We will sleep on the floor if we have to. Please do not do this to your own family. I look at the man who revoked my access to a car on Christmas Eve. I look at the woman who watched me freeze and told me to grow up. I look at the sister who faked a robbery to ensure I was cast out into the bitter cold. I turn my gaze toward the massive front doors. The winter wind is howling outside, whipping the snow across the icy driveway where the police cruiser has just pulled away. The snow tonight is not as cold as it was on Christmas, I say, my voice ringing with absolute icy finality. Start walking. The security captain steps forward with a sharp nod. His team moves in perfect synchronization, forming a tight perimeter around Richard, Catherine, and Brittany. There is no physical violence, only an impenetrable wall of suited men enforcing an absolute boundary. The remaining high society guests, the few who had lingered in the shadows of the grand foyer, out of morbid curiosity, immediately rush for the exits. They pull their fur coats tight against their necks, keeping their heads down. Not a single one of them makes eye contact with my parents. The wealthy socialites who had just spent the evening drinking vintage champagne and praising Jamal now treat my family like a highly contagious disease. The social exile is instant and permanent. Move, the security captain orders, his voice carrying zero sympathy. Catherine stumbles. Her designer silk gown drags across the slush-covered entryway. She reaches out a trembling hand toward a woman she has played tennis with for a decade, but the woman actively turns her back and quickens her pace out the door. Richard tries to maintain some fragmented illusion of dignity. He squares his shoulders and attempts to march forward, but his legs shake violently. Brittany simply weeps, her hands clutching her pregnant belly, the cheap cubic zirconia necklace flashing mockingly under the porch lights. The heavy mahogany doors close behind them with a resounding thud. I turn away from the foyer and walk smoothly up the grand, sweeping staircase. The house is completely silent now, stripped of the chaotic classical music and the frantic shouting. I reach the second floor and walk down the plushly carpeted hallway toward the master suite. I step out onto the expansive stone balcony overlooking the front gates. The freezing winter wind immediately whips through my hair, but the custom tailoring of my midnight blue executive suit holds the cold at bay. I pick up a crystal flute of champagne left behind on a patio table. Down below, the scene unfolds with poetic justice. The security guards escort my family down the long, winding driveway. The pristine white snow crunches under their expensive, impractical leather shoes. Catherine is shivering uncontrollably, her bare arms exposed to the bitter sub-zero wind. Richard wraps his arms around himself, his teeth chattering so loudly I can almost hear it from the balcony. They are experiencing the exact same agonizing biting cold they forced me into just 1 week ago. They are standing on the exact same icy concrete where they threw my canvas bag and called me a parasite. There is no luxury black car waiting for them. The Vanguard legal team had specifically intercepted their transportation logistics. Instead, a battered, rust-spotted yellow taxi crawls up to the iron gates. The security guards refuse to let the cab onto the property. My parents and my sister are forced to trudge through the deepest snowdrifts at the edge of the perimeter just to reach the idling vehicle. I take a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage champagne. The crisp, dry liquid slides down my throat, washing away 33 years of accumulated poison. The heavy, oppressive weight of their conditional love, the constant suffocating need to earn my place in my own family, completely evaporates into the winter night. I do not feel sad. I do not feel guilty. I feel a profound crystalline emptiness that rapidly fills with absolute peace. I watch as Richard struggles to open the frozen handle of the taxi door. He shoves Brittany into the cramped back seat, followed by a weeping Catherine. He climbs in after them, slamming the dented yellow door shut. The taxi's exhaust pipe coughs a cloud of dark gray smoke into the pristine snow. The vehicle slowly turns around and drives away, its dull red taillights fading into the dark, relentless winter storm. They are gone. The kingdom of lies they built on my grandfather's legacy is entirely demolished. I turn away from the freezing balcony and step back inside the master suite. I pull the heavy glass doors shut, locking out the howling wind and the bitter cold. The ambient heating system of the estate immediately wraps around me, warm and enveloping. The silence of the house is no longer eerie or intimidating. It is the beautiful, undisturbed silence of total ownership. I walk out of the master suite and head toward the grand library on the first floor. The room smells of old paper and rich mahogany, a space Grandpa Theodore had loved and my parents had completely ignored. I sit down at the massive oak desk positioned in the center of the room. I reach into my leather briefcase and pull out a brand new high-end laptop purchased legally and securely with my Vanguard executive card. I open the screen. The device powers on instantly, casting a sharp, clean glow across the darkened library. I am not going to manage hedge funds. I am not going to play the vicious, cutthroat games of high society venture capitalists. I am a systems architect. I am a builder of digital worlds. Jamal tried to steal my user interface to secure his fraudulent empire, but he never understood the foundational code. He only knew how to manipulate the surface. I open my design software. A fresh, completely blank canvas loads onto the high-resolution monitor. The pure white screen represents absolute untethered potential. Armed with Grandpa Theodore's massive financial fortress, and completely free from the toxic, suffocating anchor of my biological family, I place my hands on the keyboard. I am going to build my own technology startup from the ground up. I will hire my own developers, write my own patents, and architect a platform that no one will ever be able to steal, leverage, or control. My fingers begin to fly across the keys. The first lines of structural code appear on the glowing screen. The cursor blinks steadily, a rhythmic pulse of new life in a house that finally belongs to me. For the first time in 33 years, I am not trying to prove my worth to people who are entirely incapable of seeing it. I am simply building my future. The screen glows brightly in the dark room, illuminating my focused, determined face. The most powerful lesson from Kelsey's journey is that your worth is never determined by those who are blind to it, even if they share your bloodline. Toxic people will project their own insecurities onto you and use emotional manipulation to keep you small. True freedom begins the exact moment you stop fighting for a seat at a table where you aren't respected. Walking away from conditional love isn't a failure. It's an act of profound self-preservation. When you finally strip away the heavy, suffocating expectations of others, you create the blank canvas needed to build your own remarkable future. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment or set a difficult boundary to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Your courage might be exactly the inspiration someone else needs today to take their first step toward freedom. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering journeys of reclaiming your self-worth and building a life on your own terms.